Alright, so in this demo we're going to talk a little bit about coloring and some of the tools that at least I use and some of the principles and theories that we're talking about here with coloring. So essentially with coloring you're talking about, there's a couple of ways that you can do it. So we're talking about with coloring a process first that they call flatting. And there's two ways that we can approach this. So flatting means that you're going in with just a flat color at first, and then you're going to add your shadows afterwards. And that's the coloring method that we're kind of talking about here, regardless of which way techniques that you use here. It's coloring light to dark is what it is. So we start out with a flat color that's our light color that will act as our highlight, and then we can, in one way, build darker versions of the color on top of it. So we can start out with this kind of lightish pink color to indicate our lightest point of color in the drawing. Lay a darker version of that color on top of it for shadows, and then you can even push it a little further by putting darker versions on it. Another method that you can use is with markers is that we start off with a flat color and then we go on top of that flat color with a gray. There's two types of grays that you can use. There are cool grays, which have more blue to them, or warm grays, which have more warm red tones to them. But by putting a gray over it, it can create a shadow as well. And so that's two different ways that you can approach it. And similar methods work in digital software as well. So when I'm coloring something, with markers, there's two types of markers: watercolor and alcohol base. And I always recommend experiment with the paper that you're going to use commonly and the pens that you want to use. I use a Bristol. It's a 300 series, and it's a 100 pound Bristol, and that's what I typically do a lot of my sketches and commissions on. It's a nice smooth paper, and it takes the color really, really well. And you're going to want to take that and you're going to want to test the pens that you use. So to kind of get a feel of, because you don't want to smudge your inks. And so I've tested it on the sheet here. Like, for example, here's some Micron pens that I've used to do in my black inks. And when I put my colors on top of those Micron pens, there's a lot of smudging and smearing. And Kuretake, not a lot. And Copic tends to work well with other Copics. So if I use Copic black inks and then Copic color markers, they tend not to smear with one another. With my testing, I discovered that with my paper that I like to use, an alcohol-based marker is really good. They tend to dry quickly because of the alcohol. Alcohol evaporates it quicker than the water does. I've heard stories of alcohol fading over time. A lot of that's going to depend on the paper and how the paper is preserved. So it's okay to use alcohol base. You just got to advise people that they need to go to like a frame shop or something and have the work properly preserved, sealed, so that the colors don't fade. But alcohol based, so I use Artist Loft, which is fine. It's a cheaper equivalent to Copic. Copic, a little more variety of colors. It works. It just needed to be alcohol based. And for my inks, I use a Kuretake brush pen, but I use Faber-Castell Pitt pens. And the Faber-Castell Pitt pens won't smear when I'm using Artist Loft through my tests. So that's pretty much how, the tools that we use. When I'm coloring a piece, I tend to always keep like a scrap of the same paper, so that when I'm laying colors on down, before I lay the colors down, I can kind of test, and I can test to see if I lay this as my flat color, what would be a good shadow for it. And so in this particular case, if I lay crimson down and put this garnet on top of it, it creates a nice shadow. But I can also use the gray technique, in which case I can lay down a color and then put in this case it was a 70% cool gray, because the green is a cool color. So cool gray on top of a cool color gives you a really nice kind of shadow too. And so I always test before, and when I say test, you gotta let it dry for a couple of seconds, and then you'll see the true tone that it's going to leave you, so that when you start coloring something, you can test before you start laying your shadows in. So we're going to take this guy here, and I've already started kind of coloring his face. We'll start coloring his arm here, and again I start with a flat color. And so I'm just going to start with a flat color and just color over them. And I'm not going to get any smudging or smearing. I mean, I don't like to tempt fate and push over those black inks as little as possible, but still, I know it's going to hold up. And with my inking, it just bears repeating. It sounds kind of silly, but you just want to make sure that it's completely dry. And so even with my Pitt pens, I'll set it aside. You'll see some artists, they fan the work. I usually keep some nice kind of napkins in my art kit, and I'll dab over it and fan it just to make sure that it's thoroughly dry before I start inking it. Even at a convention or something like that, I might, ink it and then take a break and work on something else for a bit, just to give it a lot of time to dry. And so when I tend to color in, in these kind of circles rather than stripes if I can avoid it. It'll give me a more even tone. Stripes tend to look streaky, so I was taught color in circles. And it's always going to look darker when it goes to the paper, but then once the alcohol starts drying more towards its true color. So alright, so that's my flat color. That's, my base. And so from there, I'm gonna start putting in my shadows. And so if light's coming from this side based off of my shadows, then my shadows are going to be on this side. So I'm going to bring in my garnet in here. And I'm going to probably put a lot of this forearm here. His bicep's going to be in shadow. I'm going to put a lot of his forearm here in shadow too. Okay. There we go with that. And so now I put into his shadows, and I just used a darker color. Like I said, that is a method that you can use. I might come over it with like a gray let's see, we'll just put a little gray in there. Just kind of push those shadows a little bit farther. Using the feathering technique with the little stripes, thick to thin stripes. These got fur, so we want to kind of keep it a little soft. as the alcohol dries, it softens up a little bit more. Just come around the bin here. Like so, and that kind of pushes it a little further. And then in some instances, even with the flat color in there, I might come in with a Pitt pen, Pitt white pen. This is a brush pen, and I might paint in a little highlight to him. So I might brush in. And the thing with this is it's not really an opaque white. It's kind of a translucent white. So it blends in with the color really well underneath. It gives you kind of a painter look. So we'll put a little highlight into his fur on the dark layer too. And of course, the more I go over, the whiter it's going to get. So I might, his face here, so we put a little into the sides of his face. Put a little to his eyes. We'll highlight onto the top bridge of his nose and his mouth. So as it dries, gives you the Pitt pen, at least. There's a lot of whites that do it, but as it dries, it gives you a good kind of translucent effect. It's a way to push back the shadows a little bit. Jaw. And then that's a way to kind of paint in some highlights to it. Again, gives it a little depth. So yeah, you just want to start with a flat color. So like here with this Raphael sketch, we started off with this flat green and flat red, and then we came over it with a darker red. I think in this case it was a gray, probably a 70% gray, and that's what we used to add our shadows. And then I might come in with again a Pitt, because I use Pitt pens. I might come in, since the light is coming from this way, come in and paint some shadows into them, or rather some highlights into them. Just to make him pop a little bit more. And shadows are good for helping create dimension, but highlights also good for that. Like so. So yeah, it's always good to just, kind of push your drawings, make sure that you start off with a flat color, and then after you have your flat color put in, you come back over it with shadow, and you're always coloring light to dark, so your shadow is either going to be a darker version of the color, which is more natural, and then sometimes you can push that color even further with a gray, usually a darker gray. Test always on a scrap to see if you like the way it's going to look once you start putting your shadows onto it, and then make sure that your drawing is nice and dry before you start pressing in with your shadows, so that you get this kind of natural sort of look to things. But that's the basics of coloring, and when we're coloring, we start off with flats, add our shadows later, and then in some cases, we come back when we're all said and done, paint in little highlights, and that adds that extra little pop to it. But that's what we're talking about when we say we're coloring with alcohol-based markers.